Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the True Scary Stories compilation. Story 1. The Other Me. I first saw it on a rainy Thursday evening. The downpour had been relentless all day, casting a gray pall over our small town. I was driving home from work, my mind fogged by exhaustion and the rhythmic patter of rain on the windshield. As I rounded a corner near the old, abandoned textile mill, I caught sight of a figure standing by the road. It was me. My heart raced as I pulled over, unable to believe my eyes. The figure was identical to me in every way, same brown hair, same blue raincoat, even the same weary expression. I rolled down my window, but the figure simply stared back at me, its eyes hollow and devoid of life. The sight sent a chill down my spine, and I quickly drove off, glancing in the rearview mirror. It was still there, watching, as if it knew something I didn't. When I got home, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a reflection, or just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it was something more. My wife, Emily, noticed my agitation. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said with a concerned smile. I forced a laugh, not wanting to worry her. "Just a long day at work," I replied, but the image of my doppelganger lingered in my mind. The next few days were uneventful, and I began to convince myself that the encounter had been a figment of my imagination. Then, one evening, Emily mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "I ran into you at the grocery store today," she said casually over dinner. "You didn't seem to recognize me at first, which was odd. Are you okay?" My fork clattered to my plate. "Emily, I wasn't at the grocery store today. I was at work all day." Her face paled, and an uneasy silence settled between us. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I kept replaying Emily's words in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Had she really seen my doppelganger? And if so, what did it want? The following week, things took a turn for the worse. My best friend, Mark, called me in a panic. "What's going on with you, man? You've been acting really weird lately," he said. "I saw you at the park today, but you ignored me completely. Are you mad at me or something?" I assured him that I hadn't been anywhere near the park and tried to calm him down, but my own anxiety was mounting. My doppelganger was not just an eerie apparition, it was actively taking over my life. Determined to get to the bottom of this, I started keeping a detailed journal of my daily activities, noting every place I went and everyone I saw. I asked Emily and Mark to do the same, to help me track the movements of my double. But despite our efforts, the sightings continued. It seemed to be everywhere, always one step ahead, slipping through my life like a shadow. The final straw came when Emily woke me in the middle of the night, her eyes wide with terror. "I heard you talking in the living room," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But you were right here, asleep beside me." I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed and crept downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The living room was empty, but the air was thick with an otherworldly presence. I could feel it, watching me, waiting. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. The air in the living room was heavy, oppressive, like the atmosphere before a storm. I stood there, clutching the bat, my eyes darting around the shadows. Nothing moved, but the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. Emily had followed me downstairs, her presence a small comfort in the otherwise chilling room. "We need to find out what this is," she whispered, her voice shaking. I nodded, my mind racing with questions and dread. The next morning, we decided to visit the town library, hoping to find some historical context for our situation. Mrs. Hawthorne, the librarian, greeted us warmly, though her smile faded when we explained what we were looking for. Doppelgangers, she echoed, her brow furrowing. That's quite unusual. But there are old tales and local legends about them. She led us to a dusty section of the library filled with folklore and paranormal accounts. We spent hours poring over the books, piecing together fragments of stories and myths. One account stood out, a tale about a man in our town who had encountered his double in the early 1900s. According to the story, the doppelganger had slowly taken over his life, replacing him in the eyes of his loved ones until the man was driven to madness. My hands trembled as I read, the parallels to my own experience chilling me to the core. Emily found another book, this one detailing rituals and protections against malevolent spirits. Look at this, she said, pointing to a passage about using personal items to create a protective barrier. We need to try this. Desperation made us willing to try anything, so we gathered candles, salt, and personal items, photographs, keepsakes, anything imbued with our essence. That night, we performed the ritual, encircling our home with a line of salt and lighting the candles. It felt like a feeble attempt, but it was all we had. For a few days, the sightings stopped, and a fragile peace settled over us. I dared to hope that we had succeeded, that the doppelganger had been banished. But the sense of unease never fully left me. One evening, as I was finishing up some work in my home office, I heard Emily scream from the kitchen. I rushed to her side, finding her standing in the middle of a broken circle of salt, the candles extinguished. It was here, she gasped. It was right here, in our home. The fragile peace shattered. The doppelganger was becoming bolder, more brazen. It was no longer content with mere sightings, it was invading our sanctuary. We knew we had to act quickly, but we were running out of ideas. Mark, ever the skeptic, suggested we consult a medium. It's worth a shot, he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Desperation and fear had taken hold of all of us. We found a local medium, Madame Celeste, whose reputation for dealing with the supernatural was well known in the area. Her shop was filled with the smell of incense and the soft glow of candles. She listened intently as we recounted our story, her expression grave. Doppelgangers are rare, but they're dangerous, she said. They thrive on fear and chaos. We need to confront it directly. Madame Celeste agreed to perform a séance at our home. That night, the atmosphere was tense as we gathered in the living room, the candles casting flickering shadows on the walls. Madame Celeste began the ritual, her voice low and melodic, calling out to the spirit that haunted us. The air grew colder, and a palpable sense of dread filled the room. "It's here," she whispered, her eyes widening. "Prepare yourselves." The room was deathly silent as Madame Celeste's voice resonated, her chant growing louder and more insistent. I held Emily's hand tightly, feeling her tremble beside me. The candles flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. My breath caught in my throat as a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candles in an instant. We were plunged into darkness, save for the dim glow of the streetlights outside. Suddenly, a figure materialized in the middle of the room, its form dark and indistinct. My heart pounded as the figure took on a more defined shape. It was me, but twisted and distorted, with eyes that seemed to pierce through my very soul. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The doppelganger's lips curled into a sinister smile. "Because you don't deserve the life you have," it hissed. "I do." Madame Celeste stepped forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "You have no power here," she intoned, raising her hands. "Begone, spirit, and trouble this family no more." The doppelganger laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You cannot banish me so easily," it sneered. "I am tied to him, to his very essence. I am a shadow, and I will take what is mine." Emily gripped my hand tighter, her voice barely a whisper. "We have to fight it together," she said, her eyes pleading with me to be strong. I nodded, drawing on the strength of her love and our shared determination. "This is my life," I said, stepping toward the doppelganger. "You can't have it." The figure's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of doubt. Madame Celeste continued her incantations, the air thick with tension. The doppelganger began to waver, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You are not welcome here," I shouted, feeling a surge of defiance. "Leave us alone." The figure recoiled, its smile faltering. "This isn't over," it snarled, but there was a hint of uncertainty in its voice. With a final, deafening roar, the doppelganger dissolved into the air, leaving us gasping in the aftermath. The candles flickered back to life, casting a soft glow over the room. Madame Celeste slumped into a chair, exhausted but triumphant. "It's weakened," she said, her voice hoarse. "But it's not gone. You need to find out why it's tied to you, and break the connection." The following days were a blur of research and anxiety. I combed through old family records, trying to uncover any clue that might explain the doppelganger's origin. Emily and I retraced our steps, visiting the old textile mill where I had first seen the figure. It was there, amid the decaying machinery and crumbling walls, that we found a journal hidden in the ruins. The journal belonged to a distant relative of mine, a man named Samuel who had worked at the mill in the early 1900s. His entries detailed a pact he had made with a dark entity, a desperate attempt to save the failing mill and his own dwindling fortune. The entity had promised success, but at a terrible cost. The lives of his descendants would be haunted by a doppelganger, a shadow self that would seek to replace them. My blood ran cold as I read Samuel's final entry, a plea for forgiveness and a warning to anyone who might find the journal. "The curse can be broken," he wrote, "but it requires a sacrifice. Only by facing the shadow and renouncing the pact can the cycle be ended." I realized with a sinking heart that I would have to confront the doppelganger again, this time to end its hold over me once and for all. Armed with Samuel's journal and the knowledge of the curse, I felt a mix of dread and determination. The solution seemed clear, but the path was fraught with peril. Emily and I prepared for the final confrontation, gathering the necessary items for the ritual Madame Celeste had described. We needed a place of significance, where the veil between our world and the supernatural was thin. The old textile mill, where the curse had been born, was the perfect location. We arrived at the mill just before midnight, the air thick with anticipation. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie light over the decaying structure. Emily and I set up a circle of protection with salt and candles, placing the journal and a photo of Samuel in the center. Madame Celeste had agreed to join us, her presence a comforting reminder that we weren't facing this alone. As we lit the final candle, a cold wind swept through the mill, extinguishing the flames. The shadows around us deepened, and I felt the familiar chill of the doppelganger's presence. It materialized before us, its eyes burning with malice. "You cannot win," it snarled, its voice echoing through the empty mill. "I am bound to you by blood and shadow." I stepped forward, holding the journal aloft. "I know about the pact," I said, my voice steady despite my fear. "I renounce it." I will not let you take my life." The doppelganger laughed, a sound that grated against my nerves. "Words are not enough," it hissed. "You must sacrifice something precious, something of great personal value." My mind raced, trying to think of what the entity meant. Emily squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with understanding. "It's me," she whispered. "I'm the sacrifice." My heart ached at the thought. I couldn't lose her, not after everything we had been through. "There must be another way," I pleaded, but the doppelganger's grin widened. "There is no other way," it said. "Choose, or I will take you both." Tears streamed down Emily's face, but she nodded resolutely. "I love you," she said softly, stepping into the circle. "And I believe in you." She placed her hand on the journal, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "I offer myself in place of my husband, to break the curse and end this nightmare." The air around us crackled with energy as the doppelganger screamed in rage. "No!" it bellowed, its form flickering wildly. The ground shook, and the shadows seemed to come alive, writhing around us. Emily's hand tightened on mine, her presence a beacon of strength and love. "We can do this," she whispered. "Together." Drawing on the strength of our bond, I stepped into the circle with her, our hands joined over the journal. "We renounce the pact," I said firmly. "We reject the curse. Take us both, or leave us in peace." The doppelganger's form wavered, its eyes blazing with fury. The shadows closed in, and for a moment, I thought we were lost. But then, a blinding light erupted from the journal, engulfing us in its warmth. The doppelganger screamed, its form dissolving into the air. The shadows retreated, and the mill grew silent once more. We stood there, breathing heavily, the weight of the curse lifting from our shoulders. The candles flickered back to life, casting a soft, soothing glow. Madame Celeste stepped forward, her face etched with relief. "You did it," she said, her voice filled with awe. "The curse is broken." Emily and I embraced, tears of joy and relief streaming down our faces. We had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, our love stronger than ever. As we left the mill, the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. The doppelganger was gone, its power over us shattered. We had our lives back, and the future stretched out before us, bright and full of promise. The haunting was over, and we were finally free. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Voice of Shadows. The mansion stood at the edge of town, a relic of a forgotten era. My family had avoided it for generations, haunted by whispered tales of curses and restless spirits. Yet, here I was, standing before the ancient structure, keys in hand, a weight of inevitability pressing down on my shoulders. My curiosity had always been my undoing, and the discovery of an old family book in my grandmother's attic had sealed my fate. The air was thick with the scent of decay as I pushed open the creaking door. The house was in disrepair, long abandoned by the living but still very much alive with memories. Dust motes danced in the dim light that filtered through the grime-coated windows. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the sensation of eyes following my every move. I made my way to the library, the heart of the mansion, where generations of my ancestors had gathered knowledge and secrets. The room was as I imagined, walls lined with towering bookshelves, filled with tomes that held the weight of centuries. In the center of the room was a grand, mahogany desk, an artifact of another time, covered in a thick layer of dust. The book I had found, bound in cracked leather, seemed to pulse with an almost palpable energy. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded yet legible. My grandmother had spoken of it only once, with a fear in her eyes that I had never seen before. She had begged me to leave it alone, to let the past remain buried. But the allure was too strong. I sat at the desk, the book before me, and began to read. The words were in an archaic script, difficult to decipher, but I pressed on, driven by a force I couldn't explain. As I read aloud, the shadows in the room seemed to thicken, growing darker and more oppressive. I felt a chill run down my spine, the air around me growing colder with each word I spoke. It wasn't until I reached the end of the first passage that I realized something was terribly wrong. My voice had taken on a different timbre, deeper and more resonant, echoing through the room in a way that was not natural. I tried to stop, but the words kept coming, spilling from my lips in a language I didn't understand. The shadows coalesced, forming shapes that writhed and twisted, growing ever closer. Panic set in as I struggled to regain control, my hands gripping the edges of the desk until my knuckles turned white. The darkness enveloped me, and I felt a presence, ancient and malevolent, pressing against my mind. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before everything went black was a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the void. I awoke in darkness, the cold seeping into my bones. Disoriented, I tried to recall how long I had been unconscious. The memory of those glowing eyes lingered, a haunting reminder of the malevolent force I had unleashed. My throat felt raw, as if I had been screaming for hours. I stumbled to my feet, the world around me spinning, and reached for my phone. It was dead, of course. The library was unchanged, but the air was now suffused with a sense of dread. Shadows still clung to the corners of the room, darker and more oppressive than before. I had to find a way to stop whatever I had started. Desperation clawed at my mind as I fumbled through the pages of the book, searching for answers. In the dim light, I noticed a passage I had overlooked before, hidden in the margins of the text. It spoke of a ritual to bind the spirits, to lock them away once more. But it required a sacrifice, something of great personal value. My heart sank as I realized what it meant. The book had taken hold of my voice, and now it demanded a price for its secrets. I needed to understand more about my family's connection to this cursed place. Digging through the dusty shelves, I found an old journal, its leather cover worn and cracked. The name on the first page was familiar, my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Whitaker. His entries were filled with references to the book, to rituals, and to a spirit he had named the Shadow King. Thomas had been a man of ambition, seeking power through forbidden knowledge. He had summoned the Shadow King, binding it to the mansion in exchange for prosperity. But the spirit had twisted his wish, bringing ruin upon our family instead. The mansion had become a prison, not just for the spirit but for our family's souls, doomed to relive their mistakes through each generation. I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder, and I turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. It was my grandmother, or rather, her ghost. Her eyes were hollow, filled with sorrow and regret. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, her voice echoing in the silence. "The book's power is too great. You must find a way to end this." Her form flickered, and she reached out to me, her touch freezing. "There's a way," she said, her voice trembling. "But it requires a sacrifice. Your own blood, your own essence. Only then can you bind the spirit and free us all." I nodded, my mind racing. I couldn't leave my family to suffer any longer. Gathering my courage, I searched the library for anything that could help me. I found a small, ceremonial knife, its blade still sharp despite the years. Taking a deep breath, I prepared myself for what had to be done. As I made the first cut, the shadows in the room surged forward, drawn to the blood. Pain shot through me, but I didn't stop, repeating the words from the ritual passage. The room grew colder, the air filled with whispers and cries. The shadows writhed and twisted, forming a vortex around me. Just as I felt I could bear no more, the darkness exploded outward, and a deafening silence fell. I collapsed to the floor, weak and trembling, but alive. The book lay closed on the desk, its power dormant once more. But I knew this was only the beginning. The Shadow King was bound, but not defeated. The real battle was yet to come. The house felt different now, but the weight of what I had done lingered heavily. I knew the mansion's secrets ran deeper than the book and the ritual. The whispers had not ceased, only grown quieter, retreating into the dark corners of the estate. Exhausted but resolute, I decided to explore further, seeking any clues that might help me in the inevitable confrontation with the Shadow King. The hallways were a labyrinth of dust and decay, each turn revealing more of the mansion's opulent past. Portraits of my ancestors lined the walls, their eyes seeming to follow me as I walked. One painting, in particular, caught my attention, a woman with a stern expression, her eyes cold and unforgiving. The plaque beneath read, Margaret Whittaker, 1882. Something about her gaze unsettled me, as if she knew my every secret. In one of the unused bedrooms, I found a hidden door behind a rotting tapestry. The narrow passageway beyond was barely wide enough to squeeze through, leading down into the depths of the mansion. I descended, my footsteps echoing ominously in the confined space. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, growing louder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a forgotten cellar, filled with the remnants of failed experiments and dark rituals. The walls were covered in cryptic symbols, etched into the stone with a precision that spoke of madness and obsession. In the center of the room was an altar, stained with blood and surrounded by the tools of some ancient, sinister practice. As I examined the symbols, a sudden gust of wind extinguished my flashlight. The darkness was absolute, and the whispers turned to screams. I felt a presence behind me, cold and oppressive, pressing against my mind. A voice, deep and malevolent, echoed in the room. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "The blood of Whittaker binds you to me." I spun around, and in the dim light of the altar's dying embers, I saw a figure emerging from the shadows. It was Thomas Whittaker, or what remained of him. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and his body was twisted and broken. "You must destroy the book," he rasped, his voice a tortured whisper. "Only then can you sever the ties that bind us." Before I could react, the figure lunged at me, his spectral hands cold as ice. I fought back, scrambling for the ceremonial knife still tucked in my belt. The blade flashed in the darkness, and with a desperate strike, I drove it into Thomas's chest. He let out an unearthly scream, the sound reverberating through the cellar, and then he was gone, leaving only a chilling silence. Panting, I looked around, my mind racing. The book was the key, but how could I destroy something so powerful? The whispers returned, more insistent, guiding me to a hidden alcove in the wall. Inside was a small, iron box, its surface etched with the same symbols as the cellar walls. I pried it open, revealing a set of ancient scrolls, detailing a ritual of destruction. Gathering the scrolls, I made my way back to the library, my resolve hardening with each step. The mansion seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, the air thick with tension. I knew the Shadow King was aware of my intentions, and I could feel its anger growing. I had to act quickly, before it could stop me. Back in the library, I set the scrolls on the desk and began to prepare. The ritual required a blend of rare herbs, blood, and fire. As I worked, the shadows in the room grew restless, swirling around me like a living entity. The final step involved reading the incantation aloud, and as the words left my lips, the room erupted in chaos. The shadows screamed and writhed, and the book began to burn with an eerie, green flame. Just as I thought the ritual was succeeding, the fire exploded outward, throwing me across the room. The last thing I saw before losing consciousness was the Shadow King emerging from the flames, its form more terrifying than I could have imagined. Comment your favorite food if you've made it this far. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 3. Echoes in the Void. I awoke to a deafening silence. The air felt thick, as if the world had paused just to listen. My alarm clock blinked 7 a.m., but there was no buzzing, no cars passing by, no chatter from the street. I reached out for my phone, hoping to find some explanation, but it was dead. The usual hum of electricity in the house was gone, replaced by an eerie calm that made my skin crawl. Stepping out of bed, I called out, "Hello?" My voice echoed through the empty halls, met with nothing. The house was exactly as I left it the night before, but something was fundamentally wrong. The absence of life was palpable, like a void that had swallowed everyone up. As I wandered through each room, the creeping realization set in. Everyone had vanished. My family, my neighbors, the entire town. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. I made my way to the front door and swung it open, half expecting to find some answer on the other side. Instead, the world outside was a mirror of the emptiness inside. Cars were parked neatly along the street, doors left ajar as if their owners had simply walked away. The morning sun cast long shadows, but not a single soul walked beneath them. It was a ghost town, but without the ghosts. Or so I thought. I wandered through the town, searching for any sign of life. Stores were open, but the shelves were untouched. The local diner had food on the tables, still warm to the touch, as if the patrons had just stepped out. Yet, there was no one. My footsteps echoed ominously in the deserted streets, the only sound in this forsaken place. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation, that I couldn't be the only one left. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, doubt gnawed at me with a cold, relentless grip. Nightfall brought with it an even deeper dread. The world outside my door was pitch black, the streetlights flickering as if struggling against some unseen force. I locked myself inside, bolting the doors and windows, a feeble attempt at security. It was then that I heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps, shuffling along the corridor outside my bedroom. My heart pounded in my chest, the noise growing louder, closer. They were deliberate, a steady rhythm that seemed to mock my fear. "Is someone there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of my racing pulse. The footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. I strained to hear, every muscle in my body tense, but there was nothing. Minutes felt like hours, stretched thin by the weight of my dread. I stood frozen, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. But the only response was the relentless ticking of the clock, counting down the moments of this nightmare. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, unable to sleep. The footsteps returned, circling my room, a maddening loop that went on for hours. I didn't dare move, terrified of what I might find if I did. My mind raced, searching for answers in the dark. Was this some kind of prank? A dream? Or had I truly awakened to a world where I was the last soul left, haunted by the echoes of those who once were? The hours crept by, the footsteps never ceasing, a constant reminder of the void that had swallowed everything and everyone. Morning arrived with the same oppressive quiet, but the footsteps from the night before still echoed in my mind. I dragged myself out of bed, eyes bleary and body heavy from a sleepless night. The sunlight felt artificial, as if it was trying too hard to convince me that everything was normal. But the silence was deafening, louder than any sound I had ever known. Determined to find answers, I ventured outside once more, feeling like a ghost drifting through a world that had forgotten it existed. The town was unchanged from the day before, still trapped in a frozen moment. I walked past the church, its bells silent, the graveyard behind it eerily untouched. The air felt thick with something unspoken, a tension that clung to my skin. As I turned a corner, I spotted a familiar figure, Mrs. Thompson, the librarian. Relief flooded my veins, but as I approached, my heart sank. She was as still as a statue, her eyes wide open but vacant, staring at nothing. I reached out to touch her, but as soon as my fingers brushed her shoulder, she crumbled to dust, leaving only her empty clothes behind. Panic gripped me. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. What was happening? Was I going mad? I raced through the town, finding more and more of these strange, lifeless figures. All of them were frozen in place, as if captured in their last moments. Each one crumbled to ash at the slightest touch. It was as if the world had turned into a macabre museum, each person a relic of a forgotten life. The weight of it all was crushing, the realization that I was truly alone, surrounded by echoes of the past. I found myself drawn to the old abandoned house on the edge of town. It had always been a place of mystery, rumored to be haunted by the spirits of those who once lived there. In my desperation, I hoped to find some clue, some explanation for the nightmare that had become my reality. The house loomed before me, its windows dark and empty, like eyes staring into my soul. I hesitated at the threshold, the air around me growing colder. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was a relic of a bygone era, filled with dusty furniture and faded photographs. It felt like stepping into a different time, a place untouched by the chaos outside. As I wandered through the rooms, I felt a strange familiarity, as if I had been here before. My hand brushed against an old mirror, and for a moment, I saw not my reflection but that of a young woman, her face twisted in terror. I blinked, and she was gone, replaced by my own pale, frightened visage. The air grew colder still, and I could hear faint whispers, words I couldn't quite make out, but they sent chills down my spine. In the dim light, I noticed a staircase leading to the basement. The door was slightly ajar, a thin beam of light spilling out. My heart pounded as I descended, each step creaking under my weight. At the bottom, I found a small, dimly lit room. In the center was a table, and on it, a dusty old book. The air was thick with a musty smell, and the whispers grew louder, surrounding me like a shroud. With trembling hands, I reached for the book and opened it. The pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings, a language I couldn't understand. But one thing was clear, the people of the town were trapped in a curse, one that had somehow spared me. Just as I began to process this revelation, the whispers ceased, replaced by a single voice, clear and sharp. "You are not alone," it said, cold and menacing. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. The temperature dropped further, and I could see my breath in the dim light. Suddenly, the door to the basement slammed shut, trapping me in darkness. My heart raced as the voice continued, "They are watching. They are waiting." The room seemed to close in on me, the air thick with the presence of something unseen. Panic surged through me as the darkness pressed in, thick and impenetrable. I fumbled for my phone, the only source of light I could think of, but it was dead just like everything else in this forsaken town. The room felt like a coffin, and I was trapped inside. The voice continued, echoing in my mind, "They are watching. They are waiting." My skin prickled with the sensation of being observed, every hair standing on end. It felt like 1,000 eyes were upon me, unseen but all too real. I groped around the basement, searching for any way out. My fingers brushed against cold, rough stone, and then something soft, a curtain. I yanked it aside, revealing a small, boarded-up window. Desperation gave me strength, and I tore at the boards, splinters digging into my skin. Finally, with a loud crack, the last board gave way, and I squeezed through the narrow opening. I tumbled out into the cold night, gasping for breath. The air was crisp, a stark contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. I staggered away from the house. The town wasn't just deserted, it was cursed. The book in the basement had hinted at a ritual, a way to seal away the spirits of the town's former inhabitants. But something had gone wrong, trapping everyone in a ghostly limbo. I was the only one left unaffected, or so it seemed. As I walked through the dark streets, the sound of my footsteps echoed eerily, reminding me of the unseen presence I couldn't shake. The moon hung low in the sky. The once familiar streets now felt alien, filled with an oppressive energy that made my skin crawl. I knew I had to find out more, to understand what had happened. The voice had said they were watching, but who were they? And why was I the only one left? My thoughts raced, the questions swirling in my mind like a storm. The town was a labyrinth of secrets, each corner hiding another piece of the puzzle. As I made my way back to my house, I felt the familiar dread settling in. The night had been filled with strange occurrences, but nothing compared to what awaited me at home. I stood at my front door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The house was dark, the air inside heavy and still. I crept through the halls, every creak of the floorboards setting my nerves on edge. I could feel the presence of something, lurking just out of sight. The atmosphere was suffocating, thick with an unspoken threat. I reached my bedroom. The door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, my breath caught in my throat. There, in the middle of the room, was a figure. It stood with its back to me, cloaked in shadow. My heart raced, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. I took a step forward, and the figure began to turn, slowly revealing a face that was both familiar and foreign. It was me, my own face, twisted in horror, eyes wide with fear. The mirror image me spoke, its voice a chilling echo of my own. "You are not alone," it whispered, its eyes locking onto mine. "They are coming." I stumbled back, my mind reeling from the sight of my doppelganger. The figure slowly dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind a cold, empty space. My pulse thundered in my ears, each beat a reminder of my isolation in this cursed town. The room felt darker, the walls closing in. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting. I knew I couldn't stay here. I needed to find answers, to break whatever spell had ensnared everyone. With a sudden resolve, I grabbed a flashlight and headed back out into the night. My breath fogged in the chilly air as I made my way to the center of town. There, the old town hall loomed, a relic of a forgotten era. The building had always felt like the heart of the town, and now it seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. I pushed open the heavy doors, the creak of the hinges echoing in the vast, empty space. The inside was dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through broken windows. Dust particles danced in the air, illuminated like ghostly apparitions. I ventured deeper into the building. The corridors twisted and turned, each one feeling more like a maze. Finally, I found myself in the town's old records room. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty ledgers and forgotten histories. I rifled through them, searching for anything that might explain the curse. My hands shook as I pulled out a particularly old, leather-bound volume. The cover was embossed with a strange symbol, one I had seen in the book from the abandoned house. I found references to an ancient ritual, one meant to protect the town from an unseen evil. But something had gone wrong. The text spoke of a pact, a deal made with a dark force to seal away the spirits of the town's ancestors. The ritual had been botched, trapping not only the spirits but the living as well. My blood ran cold as I realized the full extent of the disaster. The ritual had locked everyone in a limbo, leaving me as the only one who could potentially break the curse. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. I was plunged into darkness, the temperature dropping rapidly. The air grew thick with the whispers of countless voices, indistinct but filled with anguish. My heart raced as I felt an icy hand brush against my arm. I spun around, the room seemingly alive with shadowy figures, their eyes glowing with a ghostly light. They closed in, their whispers growing louder, more desperate. "Free us," they chanted, their voices merging into a cacophony that rattled my bones. I clutched the book and ran, the figures trailing behind me. Their cold presence nipped at my heels as I sprinted through the labyrinthine corridors. The town hall seemed to warp and twist, its hallways stretching into infinity. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, their pleas echoing in my ears. As I reached the entrance, I felt a sudden pull, as if the building itself were trying to drag me back. I fought against the force, bursting through the doors into the night. Outside, the figures of the townspeople appearing like phantoms. They stood silently, their eyes fixed on me, waiting. In the center of the square, a circle of stones glowed with a faint, eerie light. It was the ritual site, the place where it had all gone wrong. The book in my hand seemed to pulse with energy, a dark force urging me to complete the ritual. As I stepped into the circle, the air grew thick with anticipation. I knew what I had to do, but the question lingered. Was I truly the one to break the curse, or had I been brought here for a darker purpose? The book fell open to a page covered in ancient symbols. My heart pounded as I recited the incantation, the words foreign but powerful. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the air crackled with energy. The spirits around me began to wail, their voices rising to a deafening crescendo. The circle glowed brighter, blindingly white, and I felt a surge of power flow through me. Just as I thought the ritual was complete, a terrible realization struck me. The ritual wasn't to release the spirits, it was to contain them. And as the light engulfed me, I understood that I had become the final seal, the last sacrifice to an unending curse. The last thing I saw was the town returning to normal, the townspeople reanimated and moving as if waking from a long dream. But for me, the world faded into darkness. My final thought was of the footsteps, the ones that would forever echo in the halls of my mind, as I joined the voices in the void, trapped in a limbo of my own making. Story 4. The Encroaching Shadow. I stepped into the apartment, the kind with creaky wooden floors and intricate moldings whispered tales of the past. The landlord, an eccentric old man named Mr. Henderson, had been adamant about one thing: the painting in the living room was to stay. "It's part of the deal," he said, his eyes twinkling with a hint of something I couldn't quite place. I didn't mind the painting at first. It was an old, somewhat faded portrait of a woman in a long, dark dress standing in a gloomy forest. Her eyes seemed to follow me around the room, but I chalked it up to the artist's skill. I was more interested in settling in and making the place my own. It wasn't until the third day that I noticed something odd. The woman in the painting seemed closer. Her once distant figure was now noticeably larger, her features more defined. Am I imagining things? I muttered to myself. I decided to take a photo of the painting with my phone, just to have a reference. When I compared it to the image from the day before, there was no doubt she had moved. It was subtle, but unmistakable. I tried to brush it off as a trick of the light, but an uneasy feeling gnawed at me. Days passed, and the woman's progression became more apparent. Her eyes, once hollow and distant, now bore into mine with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. I found myself avoiding the living room, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Each night, I would hear faint whispers, like someone softly calling my name. I decided to confront Mr. Henderson. He lived just a few floors up, and I knocked on his door with a sense of urgency. When he answered, he seemed expectant, as if he knew why I was there. "It's the painting, isn't it?" he asked before I could speak. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. He invited me inside. "There are things about this building, about that painting, that you need to understand," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Henderson revealed that the painting had been in the building for over a century. The woman in the portrait was believed to be Isabella, a widow who had died under mysterious circumstances. Some said she was murdered by her lover, others whispered that she took her own life in a fit of despair. Her spirit was said to be bound to the painting, forever seeking release. "She latches onto the living, trying to find a way out," he explained, his eyes wide with fear. "Once she fixates on someone, she won't stop until she has them." I realized with horror that Isabella had chosen me. I returned to my apartment, my mind racing with thoughts of how to rid myself of the cursed painting. But as I opened the door, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The woman in the painting was now mere inches from the frame's edge, her outstretched hand seeming to reach for me. Panic surged through me as I backed away, but something in her eyes held me captive, a dark promise of what was to come. Sleep eluded me that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, Isabella, with her cold, piercing gaze and her hand inching ever closer. The whispers grew louder, more coherent, and I began to make out words among the hisses and murmurs. "Help me," they pleaded, but there was an underlying menace that made my skin crawl. I decided to research Isabella's history. The local library had archives dating back centuries, and I spent hours poring over old newspapers and records. Isabella had indeed been a real person, her tragic tale documented in faded ink. She was a young widow, left alone after her husband perished in a tragic accident. Her grief turned to madness, and she isolated herself in their home until one fateful night when she vanished without a trace. Her body was never found, but her portrait, painted by her late husband, was left behind. I stumbled upon an old article about a series of mysterious deaths linked to the painting. Each victim was found in their home, eyes wide open in terror, their hearts stopped as if from sheer fright. The painting was always present, and each time, Isabella's figure had moved closer to the foreground. The pattern was undeniable, and the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was next. Desperation drove me to consult with a local historian, Mrs. Whitmore, who specialized in the paranormal. Her eyes widened when I mentioned the painting. "You need to get rid of it," she warned. "Isabella's spirit is trapped, and she's using the painting as a conduit to the living. But be careful, simply removing it won't be enough. Her hold on you is already strong." Mrs. Whitmore suggested a cleansing ritual. It required rare herbs, candles, and a recitation in Latin. I gathered the materials and returned to my apartment, feeling a mix of hope and dread. The whispers had intensified, and the air was thick with a malevolent presence. The painting now dominated the living room, Isabella's hand nearly breaking the frame's boundary. As I prepared the ritual, the temperature dropped, and an oppressive silence fell over the room. I lit the candles, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The scent of burning herbs filled the air, and I began the recitation, my voice trembling. "Liberare animum tuum, Isabella, et dimit numbers. Free your soul, Isabella, and release us." The room shook violently, and a deafening roar filled my ears. The painting seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, and Isabella's face twisted in fury. Her hand reached out, and for a moment, it felt as if icy fingers were wrapping around my throat. I gasped for breath, the words of the ritual faltering on my lips. Just when I thought I would succumb to her grip, a blinding light erupted from the candles, and a piercing scream shattered the air. When the light faded, the room was still. The painting lay on the floor, its frame cracked and the canvas torn. Isabella's figure was gone, leaving only an empty forest. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. As I bent down to inspect the painting, a cold breeze swept through the room, and I heard a familiar whisper, more menacing than before, "This isn't over." In the days that followed the ritual, I tried to convince myself that it had worked, that Isabella's spirit was finally laid to rest. The painting, now devoid of her image, was relegated to a corner, covered by a sheet. But the unease lingered, a persistent itch at the back of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Sleep was impossible. I tossed and turned, the whispers echoing in my head. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, I rose from bed and walked to the living room. The painting seemed to pulsate with a life of its own, the once empty forest now filled with dark, shadowy figures. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the figures were moving, slowly advancing towards the frame's edge. A knock at the door startled me out of my trance. It was Mr. Henderson, looking more disheveled than ever. "I've been hearing things," he said, his voice trembling. "I think she's back." His words sent a chill down my spine. If even he, with his years of dealing with the apartment's dark history, was frightened, what chance did I have? We decided to seek out Mrs. Whitmore again, hoping she might have another solution. She welcomed us into her cluttered home, her face grave as we recounted the recent events. "The ritual was only a temporary fix," she said. "Isabella's spirit is too powerful. We need to find her remains and give her a proper burial." We combed through historical records, trying to pinpoint where Isabella might have been buried. The clues led us to an abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of town, forgotten by time. Under the cover of night, armed with flashlights and shovels, we ventured into the darkness. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the air heavy with decay. We searched for hours. Just as we were about to give up, Mr. Henderson's flashlight caught something, a small, weathered headstone, barely legible. The name Isabella was etched into the stone, along with a date that matched our records. We began to dig. As we unearthed the coffin, a sense of foreboding washed over me. We pried it open, revealing Isabella's skeletal remains. I placed a rosary in her bony hands, whispering a prayer for her soul. Suddenly, the ground trembled, and a bone-chilling wail pierced the night. The shadows around us seemed to come alive, swirling and converging on the open grave. In the chaos, I felt something cold and solid clamp around my ankle, dragging me down. I screamed for help, but my voice was drowned out by the howling wind and Isabella's vengeful cries. Darkness closed in, and I realized with horror that this was far from over. Story 5. The Haunting of Holloway's. I had always been drawn to the old department store, Holloway's, with its grandiose architecture and nostalgic charm. As a child, I would peer through the glass windows, mesmerized by the intricate window displays, each mannequin poised with an uncanny realism. When I was offered a job there as a night security guard, it felt like a dream come true. Little did I know, this dream would soon morph into a nightmare. The store was a labyrinth of mahogany staircases and polished marble floors, each turn leading to another era. During the day, it bustled with customers and the echoes of laughter, but as night fell, it transformed into a silent, eerie mausoleum. The mannequins, which appeared so innocuous in the daylight, seemed to shift and watch me in the dim glow of the emergency lights. One evening, as I locked up, I noticed something strange. One of the mannequins, a regal figure in an old-fashioned gown, seemed to have shifted slightly. I shrugged it off, blaming my overactive imagination and the play of shadows. However, as I made my rounds, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, a cold prickle crawling up my spine. I must be losing it, I muttered to myself, gripping my flashlight tighter. The store was supposed to be empty, yet every creak of the wooden floors and whisper of the wind outside made my heart race. As I approached the women's clothing section, I froze. There, in the half-light, I saw it. A mannequin's head had turned to face me, its blank eyes staring unblinkingly. I took a step back, my breath hitching. Just then, the silence was shattered by a sound that sent chills down my spine, a soft, deliberate clearing of a throat. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent glee. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response came, just the oppressive silence. I forced myself to move, my steps hesitant. As I reached the main display area, the air grew colder. My eyes widened in horror as I saw several mannequins had changed positions, now arranged in a grotesque tableau. One, in particular, stood out, a figure with its hand raised as if to wave, its lifelike eyes glinting in the dim light. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me like a tangible weight. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the disturbing scene. My flashlight flickered again, casting the mannequin's shadows in twisted, contorted shapes. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. "Who's there?" I repeated, my voice barely more than a whisper. The mannequins remained silent, their porcelain faces frozen in eerie serenity. I scanned the room, my flashlight sweeping over the display cases and clothing racks. As the beam passed over the mirrors lining the walls, I saw it, my reflection wasn't alone. A shadowy figure stood behind me, barely visible in the dim light. I spun around, but there was nothing there. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. "Pull yourself together," I muttered, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white. I forced myself to continue my rounds, each step echoing through the empty store. As I passed by the children's section, I heard it again, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I stopped, straining to listen. "Help me." The voice was faint, barely more than a breath. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight into the shadows. There, huddled in the corner, was a mannequin I hadn't noticed before. It was smaller than the others, dressed in a child's outfit, its face twisted in an expression of anguish. The voice seemed to emanate from it, filling the air with a sense of desperation. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaking. The mannequin didn't respond, but the whispering continued, growing more insistent. "Help me, please." I took a hesitant step closer, my mind racing. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? Or was there something more sinister at play? As I reached out to touch the mannequin, the whispering stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the store into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, using its dim light to navigate. The mannequins loomed around me, their expressions seeming to change with each flicker of my flashlight. I stumbled through the store, my mind filled with fear and confusion. As I reached the main entrance, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, shining my light into the darkness. The regal mannequin from earlier stood in the center of the aisle, its hand outstretched as if beckoning me. My blood ran cold as I realized it had moved again. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for the door, my heart racing. As I burst into the cold night air, I looked back to see the mannequins standing in the doorway, their lifeless eyes following me. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my car, my mind reeling from the night's events. As I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I knew one thing for certain: something was very wrong at Holloway's. And I was determined to find out what. The following day, I couldn't shake the memories of the previous night. My coworkers noticed my unease, but I brushed off their concerns with feigned nonchalance. Holloway's looked innocent in the daylight, bustling with activity and chatter, but I knew better now. There was something lurking beneath its polished facade. Determined to uncover the truth, I spent my lunch break in the archives. The store had a long history, dating back to the early 1900s. Flipping through dusty ledgers and old photographs, I stumbled upon a series of disturbing events. Several employees had gone missing over the decades, their disappearances never solved. The more I read, the more I realized there was a pattern, each incident involving the mannequin displays. I found an old article about a young girl named Emily who had vanished while playing hide-and-seek in the store. Her distraught parents had searched every inch of Holloway's, but she was never found. The article mentioned her favorite hiding spot, the children's section. My mind flashed back to the whispering mannequin and the child's voice pleading for help. Could it be connected? That night, I returned to my post with renewed determination. I made my rounds with extra vigilance, every creak and whisper sharpening my focus. As the store closed and the last of the customers left, I steeled myself for what I might encounter. My heart pounded in anticipation as I approached the children's section. The air grew colder as I stepped into the aisle, the mannequin's eyes seeming to follow my every move. I found the small mannequin from before, still huddled in the corner. "Emily?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Are you here?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the soft whisper returned, more urgent this time. "Help me find them." My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the mannequins' faces. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized what she meant. She wasn't the only one trapped here. I searched the area, looking for anything out of the ordinary. As I moved a display case, I noticed a loose floorboard. My hand shook as I pried it open, revealing a small, hidden compartment. Inside, I found an old, tattered diary. The pages were brittle and yellowed with age, but the writing was still legible. The diary belonged to a former employee named Margaret, who had worked at Holloway's in the 1920s. Her entries were filled with strange occurrences, mannequins moving on their own, voices in the night, and a growing sense of dread. She wrote about a curse placed on the store by a vengeful spirit, trapping the souls of those who died within its walls. Margaret had tried to break the curse but disappeared before she could succeed. As I read her final entry, a sense of dread settled over me. She mentioned a ritual that could free the trapped souls, but it required a personal sacrifice. My heart sank as I realized what I had to do. The thought of leaving Emily and the others trapped here was unbearable. Gathering my courage, I decided to perform the ritual. I gathered the necessary items, a candle, a piece of chalk, and a personal belonging of Emily's that I had found in the hidden compartment. As I prepared the ritual, the store grew colder, the air thick with an oppressive presence. I stood in the center of the children's section, the mannequins forming a silent audience. "Emily," I whispered, lighting the candle. "I'm here to help you." I traced the chalk circle on the floor, reciting the incantation from Margaret's diary. The air crackled with energy, the shadows deepening as I spoke the final words. A sudden gust of wind extinguished the candle, plunging the store into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned to see Emily, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," she whispered. "You have to hurry." Before I could react, the mannequins began to move, their lifeless eyes glinting with malevolence. They surrounded us, their hands reaching out, their faces twisted in anger. I knew I had only moments to complete the ritual and free the trapped souls. With trembling hands, I continued the incantation, hoping I wasn't too late. The mannequins closed in, their once porcelain-like faces now twisted with grotesque, almost human-like expressions of anger and sorrow. The air grew colder, and I could feel their malevolent presence pressing in on me, each one a prisoner of the curse. Emily clung to my side, her grip tightening as she whispered, "Please, hurry." My hand shook as I held Emily's locket, an item from the hidden compartment. The final step of the ritual was to offer a piece of my own soul, binding it to the store to break the curse. I recited the incantation from Margaret's diary, my voice wavering but determined. The air around us seemed to thrum with energy, the candle flame flickering as the words left my lips. "Let these souls be free, and take mine in their stead," I whispered, feeling a strange warmth spread through my chest. The mannequins halted, their eyes turning toward me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition, as if they understood the sacrifice I was making. The circle of chalk glowed faintly, casting an ethereal light over the room. A sudden, blinding flash filled the store, and I felt a sharp pain as if my very essence was being torn apart. I cried out, falling to my knees as the energy surged through me. The mannequins stood still, their expressions softening into peaceful calm. Emily's voice echoed in my mind, "Thank you." The light faded, and I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a gentle warmth. I looked around to see the mannequins back in their original positions, their faces serene and lifeless once more. Emily was gone, and I could feel the weight of her gratitude in my heart. Just as I began to relax, thinking the ordeal was over, a low, guttural growl reverberated through the store. The ground trembled beneath me, and a dark shadow emerged from the depths of the display area. It took form, a hideous amalgamation of the souls that had been trapped, twisted by years of torment. "You cannot escape," the shadow hissed, its voice a chorus of agony. "You have freed them, but you belong to me now." The realization struck me like a blow to the chest. The curse was broken, but the malevolent force behind it remained. I stumbled to my feet, my mind racing for a solution. The shadow advanced, its tendrils reaching for me. Desperation clawed at my mind as I remembered the diary's final words. "The curse is born of pain and loss. Only through acceptance and forgiveness can it be undone." Taking a deep breath, I faced the shadow. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice steady despite my fear. "I'm sorry for all the pain you've endured. You don't have to hold on to it anymore. Let go, and find peace." The shadow hesitated, its form wavering. For a moment, I saw flashes of the past, lost loves, broken dreams, and countless years of suffering. My heart ached for the souls trapped in this malevolent entity. "You deserve to rest," I whispered, stepping forward. "I forgive you." A piercing scream echoed through the store as the shadow convulsed, its form dissolving into wisps of smoke. The air grew lighter, the oppressive darkness lifting as the entity released its hold. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The store was silent, the mannequins once again mere figures of wood and plaster. As dawn's light filtered through the store windows, I knew my life had changed forever. Holloway's was no longer a place of torment but a resting place for the souls who had been freed. I had faced my fears and emerged victorious, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left a part of myself behind. I left Holloway's for the last time, the sun rising on a new day. The store stood as a testament to the power of forgiveness and the resilience of the human spirit. And though I would carry the memories of that night with me forever, I knew I had done the right thing. As I walked away, I heard a soft, familiar whisper in the breeze, "Thank you." Emily's voice, a gentle reminder that in the end, love and forgiveness could conquer even the darkest of curses. Story 6. Echoes from the Well. The village of El Silencio was shrouded in an unsettling quietness, a place where the fog clung to the cobblestone streets like ghosts. I had heard the legends about the old well at the village's center, a relic of ancient times said to grant wishes to the desperate and the hopeful. Skepticism had always been my companion, but curiosity tugged at me when I arrived. Perhaps it was the whispered stories of fortunes gained and lost, or the unsettling tales of those who had vanished after visiting the well. Whatever it was, it drew me to the weathered stones and the deep darkness below. As I approached the well, a chill crept up my spine, like icy fingers tracing my vertebrae. The well's stone rim was worn and covered in moss, and the water below was hidden in shadow. My breath fogged the air as I stood there, clutching the small, worn coin in my hand, a relic passed down in my family for generations. The villagers' warnings echoed in my mind, "Be careful what you wish for. The well listens, but it doesn't always grant what you desire." I dismissed their words, thinking them mere superstitions, the kind of tales that kept children awake at night. I tossed the coin into the well, the clink of metal against stone echoing in the silent square. I closed my eyes, whispered my wish, and waited. Seconds passed, then minutes, with nothing but the sound of the wind whistling through the narrow alleys. I felt foolish, standing there, as if expecting a miracle. Just as I turned to leave, a soft splash sounded from the depths. My heart skipped a beat. Curiosity overpowered caution, and I leaned over the edge, peering into the blackness below. To my shock, the coin came hurtling back up, striking the stone beside me with a wet, metallic thud. The dim light of the lanterns revealed it smeared with fresh blood, glistening ominously. My hand trembled as I picked it up, the warm, sticky liquid seeping into my fingers. The well's mouth seemed to gape wider, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to ask for another wish, despite the horror that churned in my gut. As I stood frozen, the fog thickened around me, muffling the world outside the square. Shadows seemed to dance at the edges of my vision, and a low murmur emanated from the well, like a distant, echoing chant. Panic rose within me, and I stumbled back, the coin clutched tightly in my hand. The village's quiet became oppressive, every creak and whisper amplified in the silence. I backed away, heart pounding, and fled the square, the sensation of being watched never leaving me. The eerie silence of El Silencio seemed to follow, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of the bloodied coin haunted my thoughts, and the memory of that murmur gnawed at my sanity. What had I wished for? What had the well granted in return? The answers eluded me, but one thing was clear: the well was not a benevolent force. It was something far darker, an entity that thrived on the fears and desires of the villagers. As the hours crept by, the realization that something had been set in motion, a force beyond my understanding, kept me wide awake. The well had thrown the coin back, and with it, a message I couldn't decipher. But the implications were terrifyingly clear. The next morning, a thick fog hung over El Silencio, even heavier than usual, blanketing the village in a ghostly pallor. Despite the uneasy memory of the previous night, curiosity gnawed at me. I ventured back to the well, determined to uncover the truth behind the strange events. As I walked through the narrow streets, the villagers watched from their windows, eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. They knew. Somehow, they always knew when the well had chosen someone. At the well, I hesitated, the stone rim cold under my fingers. The coin, now cleaned of its gruesome stains, felt heavier in my pocket. I stared into the depths, half expecting to see something staring back. But there was only darkness. I felt a presence, an oppressive weight, as if the air itself had grown denser. A voice broke the silence, startling me. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered, barely more than a breath. I spun around, heart racing, to find an old woman standing at the edge of the square. Her face was lined with age, eyes sharp and knowing. "The well takes more than it gives," she continued, her voice low and weary. "Those who come seeking answers find only questions. And those who ask for favors often pay with more than they bargained." I swallowed, trying to mask the fear that twisted in my stomach. "What does it want?" I asked, my voice barely a croak. The old woman shook her head, her expression one of deep sorrow. "It wants what it has always wanted, to feed on our fears, our desires. It's a portal, a gateway to something far beyond our world. It sees your wish, twists it, and gives you something you never expected. Something you can't escape." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Before I could ask more, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the fog as swiftly as she had appeared. Left alone with my thoughts, I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. The well was more than a simple village legend, it was a curse. I had awakened something, and now I needed to understand what. I couldn't shake the feeling that the well had marked me, that its dark tendrils were slowly wrapping around my fate. As the days passed, the fog seemed to grow thicker, the nights darker. Strange occurrences plagued my every waking hour. Shadows moved on their own, flickering just out of sight. I heard whispers in the silence, voices that spoke of secrets long buried. The villagers began to avoid me, their once friendly faces now tight with fear and suspicion. I was an outsider, marked by the well, and they wanted nothing to do with me. One night, as I lay in bed, the room grew unbearably cold. My breath fogged in the air, and the shadows lengthened unnaturally. A faint, rhythmic tapping began, coming from the direction of the well. It was as if something was calling me, beckoning me to return. Heart pounding, I rose from the bed and peered out the window. The fog outside was thick and swirling, yet I could see a faint, ethereal glow emanating from the well's direction. Compelled by an unseen force, I dressed and slipped out into the night. The streets were eerily silent, the air thick with anticipation. As I approached the well, the glow grew brighter, a ghostly light that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch the rim, the cold stone sending a shiver up my arm. From the depths, a soft whisper reached my ears, growing louder and clearer with each passing second. It was a voice, familiar yet strange, calling my name. Terrified but unable to resist, I leaned over the well's edge. The glow intensified, and for the briefest moment, I saw something in the depths, a face, pale and distorted, eyes wide with an unearthly hunger. My heart nearly stopped as the face broke into a chilling smile. Then, with a blinding flash, the light vanished, leaving only darkness and a lingering echo of that haunting voice. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, as the night closed in around me. The well had shown me its true nature, and I realized, with dawning horror, that the worst was yet to come. The following days blurred together in a haze of dread and paranoia. The fog never lifted, clinging to the village like a ghostly shroud. I could feel the well's presence everywhere, an unrelenting pressure on my mind. The villagers kept their distance, whispering behind closed doors. They knew the well had its grip on me, and their fear was palpable. But my terror ran deeper, for I knew something from the well had followed me home. It started with the small things, objects misplaced, cold spots in the house, and the sensation of being watched. I could no longer ignore the signs. The coin, which I had kept out of a sense of morbid curiosity, seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. Whenever I touched it, a chill seeped into my bones, and faint whispers echoed in my ears. At night, the sounds grew louder, morphing into hushed conversations and eerie laughter. Shadows danced on the walls, figures just beyond recognition. Sleep became impossible, as every creak and groan of the old house felt like a prelude to something sinister. The worst was the dreams, or rather, the nightmares. In these dreams, I was trapped in the village square, the fog so thick it felt like a suffocating blanket. The well stood before me, its mouth gaping like a hungry maw. And then, from the depths, came the voices, pleading, crying, and accusing. They told stories of betrayal, of wishes gone horribly wrong, of lives taken as payment. Among them was the voice I had heard on that fateful night, the one that had called my name. It spoke of promises and debts, of a curse that could not be undone. Each morning, I woke with a jolt, drenched in sweat, the voice's accusations ringing in my ears. Desperate for answers, I sought out the old woman who had warned me at the well. It took days of searching through the fog-bound village before I found her in a small, dilapidated house on the outskirts. Her face was even more lined with age, eyes tired but sharp. She welcomed me without surprise, as if she had been expecting my visit. As I poured out my experiences, she listened in silence, nodding occasionally. When I finished, she sighed and leaned back in her chair, her gaze piercing through me. "You are marked," she said gravely. "The well does not let go easily. It grants wishes, yes, but it demands a price. And once you've made your wish, you're bound to it, into the well. The shadows you see, the voices you hear, they are the well's way of keeping you tethered, feeding off your fear and regret." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "But there must be a way to stop it," I pleaded. "To break the connection." She shook her head slowly. "No one escapes the well's grasp. The best you can do is survive, to resist its pull and refuse to make another wish. But know this, the well is patient. It waits for the right moment, the right weakness. And when it strikes, it is merciless." I left her home with a sinking heart, her words echoing in my mind. There was no escape, no way to undo the horror I had unleashed. The well had chosen me, and now, it would not rest until it had claimed what it was owed. That night, the fog seemed thicker than ever, the village swallowed in its ghostly embrace. As I lay in bed, the cold seeping into my bones, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. But now, they were not alone. A shadowy figure stood at the foot of my bed, its outline barely visible in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as it slowly raised a hand, pointing toward the door. A compulsion stronger than fear gripped me, and I found myself rising from the bed, following the figure through the silent house. It led me to the front door, which swung open with a creak. Outside, the fog swirled ominously, and the figure beckoned me to follow. Heart pounding, I stepped out into the night. The village was eerily silent, the only sound the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. The figure led me through the empty streets, its form becoming more distinct with each step. It wore a tattered cloak, its face hidden in shadow. The air grew colder, the fog thickening, until we reached the village square. There, in the center, the well stood waiting, a dark sentinel in the mist. The figure stopped beside it, turning to face me. For the first time, I saw its eyes, pale and glowing, filled with an unholy hunger. A twisted smile spread across its face as it gestured toward the well. "It's time," the voice from my dreams whispered, its tone both inviting and menacing. My heart raced as I looked down into the abyss, the darkness seeming to pulse with a life of its own. The air crackled with anticipation, and I knew, with a sickening certainty, that the well was demanding its due. The figure reached out, its hand cold as ice, and I felt a pull, a force drawing me closer to the edge. As the figure's icy grip tightened around my arm, the fog thickened, cloaking the village in an oppressive gloom. The well's pull grew stronger, and the murmurs from its depths became a cacophony of voices, each one more desperate than the last. The pale eyes of the figure bore into me, a silent command urging me forward. My body moved of its own accord, feet shuffling toward the well's yawning mouth. Panic surged through me, but it was as if my will had been stripped away, leaving only a hollow shell. I reached the well's edge, my heart hammering in my chest. The darkness below seemed to pulse, alive with unseen movement. As I leaned over, the voices rose in a discordant chorus, pleading and demanding. "Join us," they whispered, the words wrapping around my mind like a vice. I could feel their despair, their anger, the weight of countless souls trapped within the well's grasp. The figure beside me remained silent, its presence a looming shadow at the periphery of my vision. The coin in my pocket grew unbearably cold, searing through the fabric. With a sudden burst of clarity, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the coin, its surface glinting ominously in the dim light. The figure's eyes followed my movement, a hint of anticipation flickering in their depths. I understood then, The well's gift was a curse, and the coin was the key. To make a wish was to forge a bond with the well, a bond that could only be broken by fulfilling its insidious demand. The realization brought a fresh wave of terror. There was no escape, only the inevitable descent into darkness. Desperate to resist, I tried to hurl the coin back into the well, but my hand froze mid-motion. The figure's cold grip tightened, and a voice, smooth and insidious, slithered into my mind. "You cannot resist. The well has chosen you." My body shuddered, caught in a battle between my will and the dark force that sought to claim me. The air around me grew thick, suffocating, as the voices from the well rose to a fever pitch. The ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble, and the world blurred at the edges. My vision tunneled, narrowing to the well's gaping maw, and the void within. In a final act of defiance, I threw the coin with all my might. Time seemed to slow as the coin arced through the air, spinning in the dim light before plunging into the depths. The well emitted a deafening roar, the ground shaking with its fury. The figure released its hold, and I stumbled back, breathless. For a moment, silence reigned, the air heavy with anticipation. Then, from the darkness, a pale hand reached out, grasping the well's edge. Another followed, and then another, as shadowy forms began to emerge from the depths. One by one, the souls of the damned clawed their way out, their faces twisted in agony. They surrounded the well, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The figure stood among them, its face no longer hidden. It was a twisted reflection of my own, a visage of despair and torment. The realization hit me like a blow. These were the souls trapped by the well's curse, each one bound by a wish made in desperation. And now, they were free, but at a terrible cost. The well had taken my wish and twisted it, using my desperation to release its captives. As the last of the souls climbed out, the ground beneath the well split open with a thunderous crack. The fog swirled violently, and the air filled with an ear-splitting shriek. The well's power waned, its hold on the village broken, but the price had been paid. The souls, freed from their torment, turned to me with expressions of gratitude and sorrow. The figure that wore my face approached, its eyes filled with a strange compassion. "You have freed us," it whispered, "but you cannot escape your fate. The well always demands a soul." Before I could react, the ground gave way, and I fell into the darkness. The voices of the freed souls faded, replaced by a deafening silence. Cold enveloped me, and I felt myself being pulled down, deeper and deeper. In the distance, a faint light flickered, growing brighter as I descended. The realization dawned on me like a cold splash of water. I was to take their place. The well had claimed its due. As the light engulfed me, the weight of the curse settled into my bones, and I understood the full horror of my fate. The well had taken my soul, and in exchange, it had freed the others. But now, it was my turn to haunt the depths, to become another voice in the chorus of the damned, warning those who might follow. The light grew blinding, and then, there was nothing. Only darkness, and the echoing laughter of the well, as it sealed my fate forever. Story 7. The Lightning Watchers. It all began on a night much like any other, a night when the skies darkened with the promise of a storm. I've always loved thunderstorms, the way the heavens seem to release their pent-up anger and the electric anticipation in the air. But something about this storm was different. The wind howled with an eerie, mournful wail, and as the first crack of thunder shook my small, old house, I felt a chill creep down my spine. Sitting in my dimly lit living room, I felt the hairs on my neck prick up, as though sensing an unseen presence. The power flickered as the storm intensified. Outside, lightning flashed, illuminating the drenched world in blinding white. It was then that I first saw them, a crowd of shadowy figures standing just beyond the boundary of my property, their outlines barely discernible through the sheets of rain. My breath caught in my throat. There must have been a dozen of them, motionless and silent, their faces obscured by the night. The next instant, the lights flickered again, and they vanished as if they had never been there. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding. Rushing to the window, I peered out into the darkness, searching for any sign of the figures. But the yard was empty, save for the swaying trees and the occasional flash of lightning. My rational mind tried to reason it away, Perhaps it was a trick of the light, a play of shadows in the storm. Yet, deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. For the next few minutes, I sat frozen, staring into the night, waiting for another flash. When it came, so did they. The lightning revealed them again, standing closer this time, just a few feet from the window. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Their presence felt tangible, suffocating. I could almost feel their gaze upon me, even though I couldn't see their eyes. As quickly as they appeared, they disappeared with the next flicker of the lights. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. This wasn't just a coincidence. The storm, the figures, they were connected, but how? A memory from my childhood surfaced, a tale of restless spirits that appeared during thunderstorms, bound to the lightning that split the sky. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I realized I needed answers. I grabbed my phone and dialed my friend, Sarah, a local historian with a penchant for the supernatural. "Sarah, you need to come over. There's something happening here, something strange," I stammered, trying to keep my voice steady. She listened, concern evident in her voice as I described the figures and their eerie appearances. She promised to come over immediately, bringing with her old books and knowledge of the town's history. As I hung up, another flash of lightning illuminated the room, and I saw them again, closer than ever, almost pressed against the glass. My heart stopped. The lights flickered, and they were gone. But the sense of dread remained, palpable and oppressive. I knew they would be back, and with each strike of lightning, they would inch closer. I could feel it in my bones, a chilling certainty. As I waited for Sarah, the storm raged on, and the air thickened with an unspoken menace. I had to know who they were, and why they were here. But more than that, I had to survive the night. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Sarah arrived in record time, rain-soaked and breathless. She carried an old leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age, and a determined look in her eyes. As she stepped into the house, the warmth and light offered a brief respite from the storm outside. "You weren't kidding," she said, shaking off the rain. "This storm feels wrong." We sat at the dining table, and I recounted the events in more detail, describing the shadowy figures that appeared with every flash of lightning. She listened intently, flipping through the book with practiced ease. "This town has a history," she began, her voice low. "A dark one. There are legends of spirits bound to thunderstorms, spirits of those who died tragically and whose souls can't move on. They appear when the storm is at its peak, drawn by the energy." She paused, looking up at me with concern. "If what you're seeing is real, these could be those spirits." A loud crash of thunder punctuated her words, making me jump. I glanced nervously at the window, half expecting to see the figures staring back at me. "But why here? Why now?" I asked, trying to understand the connection. Sarah sighed, turning the pages to a specific passage. "There's a story about this very neighborhood, about a family that lived here a century ago. They disappeared during a storm much like this one, never to be seen again. Some say they were cursed, their spirits trapped in a perpetual storm, seeking vengeance." The air in the room seemed to thicken with the weight of her words. It made sense, in a twisted way. My house stood on the site of that family's old home. Could they be the ones haunting me? My thoughts were interrupted by another flash of lightning. The figures appeared again, closer than ever. I could see them more clearly now, gaunt faces, hollow eyes, their expressions twisted in anguish. My stomach churned, and a cold dread washed over me. Sarah gasped, her eyes widening. "They're getting closer," she whispered. "We need to do something before they get in." Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the book, searching for something, anything, that could help. I felt a creeping terror settle on my chest. What if we couldn't stop them? What if they were already inside, watching us, waiting? The thought sent a shiver down my spine, and I stood up, pacing the room. Suddenly, Sarah found what she was looking for. "Here," she said, pointing to an old ritual. "It's an exorcism of sorts, to banish spirits bound to a place." but it needs to be done during the storm's peak, when the spirits are most vulnerable. My heart sank. The storm was raging, but we had no idea when it would peak. The figures outside were becoming more frequent, more aggressive, and I could feel their presence growing stronger. We hurried to prepare, gathering candles and other items mentioned in the ritual. The tension was palpable, the air charged with anticipation. As Sarah began the incantation, I glanced nervously at the window. The figures were right up against the glass now, their hollow eyes boring into mine. A deep, resonant thunder shook the house, and the lights flickered ominously. My breath caught in my throat, and I knew we were running out of time. The storm was reaching its climax, and so were the spirits' attempts to break through. As Sarah's voice rose and fell in a rhythmic chant, the room seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly energy. The candles flickered violently, their flames dancing in the shifting air. I felt a strange pressure building, as if the very atmosphere was compressing around us. The shadows outside the window grew more defined, more corporeal, and their faces contorted with a silent scream. My heartbeat quickened, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating stillness. The storm outside raged with an unholy fury. Thunder clashed overhead, and lightning carved through the sky, each bolt illuminating the spectral crowd gathered at my window. They were no longer just shadows, they were almost tangible, their translucent forms struggling to cross the threshold into my home. Sarah continued the ritual, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "We call upon the ancient forces," she intoned, "to sever the ties that bind these lost souls to this place. Let them find peace, and let this home be cleansed." Suddenly, the air grew cold, biting through my clothes. A chill that seemed to emanate from the spirits themselves seeped into the room. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I shivered uncontrollably. It felt like the room was caught between two worlds, and we were precariously balanced on the edge. The figures outside pressed closer, their faces inches from the glass, eyes hollow and desperate. I could almost hear them, faint whispers that mingled with the howling wind. Then, the lights flickered and went out. Darkness enveloped us, save for the dim glow of the candles. My heart lurched in my chest as I realized we were utterly vulnerable. Sarah's voice wavered for the first time, a note of panic creeping in. "We need to finish this," she urged, her voice a strained whisper. "They're getting stronger." Her eyes met mine, and I saw fear there, raw and unguarded. The realization struck me like a cold slap. We might not be able to stop this. I swallowed hard, feeling a cold sweat break out across my skin. The storm outside seemed to reach a fever pitch, the wind screaming and rain lashing against the house. The figures at the window began to pound on the glass, their silent screams becoming audible, a cacophony of sorrow and rage. The sound was unbearable, a symphony of despair that clawed at my sanity. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it did little to block out the noise. In the dim candlelight, Sarah continued the ritual, her voice rising in urgency. She spoke of breaking chains, of releasing spirits from their torment. The air grew heavier, and a low hum filled the room, resonating in my bones. I felt a pressure build in my head, as if something was trying to push its way into my thoughts. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through my skull, and I gasped, clutching my head. The figures outside seemed to sense our weakness, their pounding more insistent, their cries more frantic. With a final, desperate cry, Sarah completed the ritual. The room seemed to explode with light, a blinding flash that sent me stumbling back. The figures at the window recoiled, their forms distorting and twisting. For a moment, everything was chaos, a whirlwind of light, sound, and energy. I felt a force pull at me, like a riptide dragging me under. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The room fell silent, the storm outside subsiding to a dull roar. Breathless and shaken, I looked around. The figures were gone, vanished into the ether. The candles flickered, their flames steady once more. Sarah slumped in her chair, exhausted but relieved. But even as a sense of calm washed over me, a nagging doubt lingered. Had we truly banished the spirits, or merely postponed their return? As I looked out the window, the storm's final growls echoed in the distance, and a single, haunting thought struck me: What if we had only angered them? The air was thick with the aftermath of the ritual, the silence oppressive and unnatural. Sarah and I sat in the dim light, the flickering candles casting long shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that had just happened. The storm outside had quieted to a gentle rain, a stark contrast to the chaos that had raged only moments before. But the sense of unease lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over us. "Do you think it's over?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's eyes were fixed on the old book, her brow furrowed in concentration. I think so," she replied hesitantly. "The ritual should have severed their connection to this place. But I've never done this before. I can't be sure." Her uncertainty sent a chill down my spine. The thought of those spirits still lingering, still watching, was almost too much to bear. We sat in silence, the weight of the night's events pressing down on us. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion set in. My eyelids grew heavy, and I found myself nodding off. But just as I was about to succumb to sleep, a sharp crack of thunder jolted me awake. My heart raced as I realized that the storm had not passed, it was simply gathering strength. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and the air grew colder, sharper. Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. "No, this can't be happening." She scrambled to her feet, frantically flipping through the book. "There has to be something we missed, some detail." Her voice trailed off as she found the page she was looking for. Her face paled, and she looked at me with a mixture of horror and realization. The ritual, it wasn't to banish them. It was to awaken them. A sickening dread washed over me. I stood up, my legs trembling. "What do you mean, awaken them?" I demanded, my voice rising in panic. Sarah's hands shook as she pointed to a passage in the book. The storm, the spirits, they were never bound to this place. "They were bound to me," she whispered, her voice breaking. I must be a descendant of that family." The ritual didn't sever their connection, it strengthened it. As her words sank in, the lights flickered ominously. A low, mournful wail echoed through the house, growing louder and more insistent. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with a palpable, malevolent presence. My breath came out in ragged gasps as I realized what was happening. The spirits were not gone, they were here, inside the house. And they were angry. The room seemed to darken, shadows creeping along the walls like living creatures. I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek, and I recoiled in terror. Sarah was chanting frantically, her voice drowned out by the rising cacophony. The spirits' voices filled the room, a chorus of despair and rage. They swirled around us, their forms becoming more defined, more solid. They had awakened, and they were no longer bound by the storm. In the midst of the chaos, I heard a familiar voice, a soft, sorrowful whisper. I turned, my eyes wide with disbelief. It was my mother, or rather, her spirit. She reached out to me, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. "I tried to protect you, but it's too late." My heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming grief. The realization hit me like a wave. The spirits were not just any spirits, they were my ancestors, trapped in a cycle of torment, now awakened and seeking something from me. As the storm reached its climax, the spirits closed in, their intentions clear. They wanted to reclaim what was theirs, to bring me into their world. I felt a cold grip on my arm, pulling me towards the darkness. Panic surged through me, and I struggled to break free. But their hold was too strong. Sarah's chanting grew louder, more desperate, but it was drowned out by the spirits' cries. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the pleading, sorrowful gaze of my mother's spirit, and then everything went black. The storm continued to rage outside, a relentless reminder of the spirit's awakening. But inside the house, all was silent. The candles flickered out, leaving nothing but darkness and the faint echo of the spirits' voices, lost in the void. And as the final clap of thunder shook the foundations, it became clear that the cycle was complete. The spirits had claimed their prize, and the house was once again a place of eternal unrest. Leave your favorite color in the comments if you've made it this far. The end. Thanks for watching.